In this brief video, I'm going to be providing you with a review of neurons. I'm going to be reviewing the basic parts of the neuron, and I'm also going to be reviewing how they communicate with one another and neurotransmitters. It's been estimated that there are around 85 billion neurons in the brain. To reach this huge target, a developing baby in the womb must create around 250,000 neurons per minute. Each neuron is connected to another 1,000 neurons, creating an incredibly complex network of communication. Neurons are considered the basic units of the nervous system. Neurons are highly specialized nerve cells that are responsible for communicating information in both chemical and electrical forms. There are also several different types of neurons that are responsible for different tasks in the human body. In this course, I would just like you to know about the overall basics behind the neuron. So this would include things like the basic parts of the neuron, and we'll be looking at that. I'd also like for you to know how neurons communicate, the basics of this, and we'll be looking at that as well. And I'd also like for you to know about neurotransmitters. And again, we'll be taking a look at that here too. So if you look at this slide, you'll see that there are some major structures of the neuron. You'll see many of those are in the upper right-hand corner image. You'll see also that there are some definitions of these major structures. So let's look at each of these. The first thing that you'll see in this image is what are called the dendrites. And the dendrites receive information from neighboring neurons. They are the receptive surface of the neuron. The next thing that you see, and I'm moving from left to right, is you'll see the cell body. The cell body contains the cell nucleus, and it's the lifeblood of the cell. You'll then see what's called the axon. The axon carries nerve impulses from the cell body to other neurons. I think it's interesting to note that some neurons have short axons while others can be quite long. So if we think about, for example, a very tall basketball player, the neurons in that basketball player's leg could actually be up to 3 feet in length, and that's because of the axon being so long. That is what's giving that neuron its length. And then we have what's called the axon terminal, and this is where we will find the synapse. We'll be talking about the synapse here in just a few moments, but this is where we see the release of what are called neurotransmitters. We'll be looking at those here in just a few moments as well. But as you've learned from your readings and from the other videos that I have on the content page of the course, you note that neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that facilitate the transmission of information from one neuron to the next. So we'll be looking at those, and we'll look at some examples of neurotransmitters. The other main structure that you'll see is what's called the myelin sheath. And if you look at the image on the right, you'll see that the myelin sheath is surrounding the axon. It's a fatty insulation that surrounds the axon, and it acts to improve the speed of the conduction of the neural impulse. So its main purpose is to insulate the axon, and then it speeds up that conductivity of the electrical impulse. So myelin is promoting a fast transmission of electrical signals. I think a useful analogy is that if the axon itself is like an electrical wire, myelin is like insulation that surrounds it, speeding up the impulse. Actually, if you had an axon that didn't have a myelin sheath, what you would find is that this axon would experience an electrical signal leakage. So this myelin sheath is very important in insulating that axon and helping to speed up the transmission of that impulse. I'd also like to point out that myelin seems to be critical to healthy functioning of the nervous system. In fact, disruptions in the myelin sheath have been linked to a variety of disorders. So now that we've looked at the basic structures of the neuron, let's take a look at how neurons transmit and receive information. So individual neurons make connections to target neurons, and they stimulate or inhibit their activity. Now, I want to point out that this is not a physical connection. The connection is happening because of neurotransmitters communicating between these neurons. Neurons are not touching one another. So for neurons to communicate, they need to transmit information from one another or between one another, and they're doing this by way of neurotransmitters. And then, of course, for communication to take place within the neuron, we need that electrical signal. So we can see here that neurons use both electrical signals and chemical messengers. And dendrites from neurons, so remember those dendrites, those branch-like structures, they receive information from other neurons and from sensory receptors. And then this information is passed down to the cell body onto the axon. Once the information has arrived at the axon, it travels down the length of the axon in the form of an electrical signal that's known as an action potential. So what is an action potential? This is the process that happens during the firing of a neuron. Part of the neural membrane opens to allow positively charged ions into the cell and negatively charged ions out. This then causes a rapid increase in a positive charge. When the charge reaches a certain level, the impulse moves down the nerve fiber. Neurons always fire at their full strength. This ensures that the full intensity of the signal is carried down the nerve fiber and then transferred to the next cell, and that the signal doesn't get weak or become lost. So now that you've learned about action potential, let's take a look at communication between neurons. Synaptic transmission is the process in which nerve impulses move from one nerve cell to another. For one neuron to communicate with another neuron, the electrical process that I previously described must change to chemical communication. This communication occurs at the synaptic cleft. And you can see this here in this image. Here what we have is a junction that's between one nerve cell and another. And this communication is happening through substances that are called neurotransmitters. And again, neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that are facilitating the transmission of information from one neuron to the next. If you'll look at this image, what you'll see is that the top portion of the image is the axon terminal. And the bottom portion that's green, this is part of the dendrite. And so the neurotransmitters are released from this neuron that's yellow, from the axon terminal, and they then bind to the neighboring neuron that on their dendrites. And so the receptors on that neighboring neuron, they act as locks for certain neurotransmitters. So, for example, you've learned about dopamine in your reading. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and it plays a very important role in producing feelings of pleasure. And this is very important because it promotes human motivation. So whenever you eat, for example, there's a surge of dopamine. Whenever you do anything that you're enjoying, there's a surge of dopamine. And it's especially important for those things that are related to survival and reproduction. So dopamine receptors are on the dendrites that you see here. And dopamine binds onto those dopamine receptors. And dopamine acts like a key, okay? And the receptor is like a lock. And dopamine has a very specific shape. And so it binds onto the lock that has that same shape, just like a lock and key for your house or your car. So this receptor cell is then stimulated by the neurotransmitter, and then it responds by producing its own action potential. And this then either produces an action or it acts as a relay station, sending the message through a pathway of neurons. Now, I want to share with you too that when the neurotransmitter has completed its journey across the synapse, it has to be removed. And this is done by being broken down by enzymes that are in the cleft or by reuptake back up into the original cell. And I share this because many pharmacological agents, like antidepressants, for example, they block this process by increasing the amount of neurotransmitter in the synapse that's available. And here's a very simplified example of what's taking place. We have neuron 1, neuron 2, and neuron 3. We have the electrical impulse traveling down the axon, and then we see communication that's taking place between the neurons. It's happening at the synapse. The communication is happening because of those neurotransmitters. And remember, those neurotransmitters act like keys, and the receptor sites on the dendrites act like locks. And then we see the process continue again. So let's just take a brief moment to look at a few neurotransmitters and what their functions are. Remember, neurotransmitters are the chemical part of this communication process that is happening between neurons. And an example of a neurotransmitter that most of you are now familiar with from your readings and of course from your discussion is serotonin. And serotonin plays a role in many different things, but the things that we commonly think of when we think about serotonin include regulating mood, appetite, sleep, and the body's circadian rhythm. Low levels of serotonin are also associated with aggression. Now, there's a disorder that some of you are familiar with. It's called seasonal affective disorder, and it causes some symptoms of depression in the fall and winter. Some of you might be vulnerable to this, and this is happening when daylight is less abundant. And research indicates that this disorder, seasonal affective disorder, is linked to lower levels of serotonin. And I think it's interesting to note that some evidence suggests that people can increase serotonin naturally through being exposed to bright light, especially sunlight. And you can also increase it through vigorous exercise. These are certainly not a replacement for more traditional types of therapy, but especially for people who suffer from seasonal affective disorders, these approaches can be very helpful. And you can actually purchase lights on Amazon and on many different websites that mimic that natural light if you're not able to get outside and you're experiencing some of the symptoms of seasonal affective disorder. I want to point out too that there are at least 15 different types of serotonin receptors. And what's very interesting too is that the central nervous system only contains 2% of the body's serotonin. The majority of serotonin is found in the gastrointestinal tract. And that's why some of you may have heard about some of the research and interest in the GI tract and its relationship to mood and feelings of well-being. Another neurotransmitter that is important, and of course they're all important, but I think when we're thinking about psychology, and you're going to be learning about learning and memory in particular later in our next unit, you have a neurotransmitter that's called acetylcholine, and it plays a role in cognition, in thinking and memory, also in our sleep-wake cycle, our parasympathetic nervous system. And remind yourself, what is the parasympathetic nervous system? What's it responsible for? You should know that it's responsible for homeostasis. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic nervous system brings us back to that balanced state of functioning. So those are just a few of the things that acetylcholine is responsible for. And then I'll share one other one that I want to share with you is dopamine. You learned about that here just a few moments ago. Remember, dopamine is that neurotransmitter that's responsible for feelings of pleasure. It's associated with those things that we do that are related to survival and reproduction, but certain behaviors have hijacked that system. So In particular, you will find that when people have addiction, especially when we think about addiction to amphetamines and cocaine, you're going to see increasing levels of dopamine, especially initially. And then what can happen is that over time, of course, the person develops a tolerance and needs more and more of that drug to get any sort of feeling of euphoria or pleasure. And then eventually they just need that drug to feel normal. So dopamine is involved in lots of other things, but it's very well known for its responses or emotional responses like our feelings of euphoria and pleasure. It's also important in cognition and in motor control, but you should definitely know that it's important for those feelings of pleasure and experiences of euphoria. And we'll be looking at that more in our next module. So here we have the 5 basic steps of action potential. Like I said, you do not need to know this. I think this is beyond the scope of our introductory psychology class, but you should know those things that I've reviewed. Make sure that you know the basic parts of the neuron. You should know about action potential, the basics, what you learned. You should also know about how neurons communicate with one another. You should remember, as you're learning about those basic structures, make sure you know what the function of each of those are. And don't forget about the myelin sheath. And again, remember what the action potential is, how that's happening, but you don't need to know the details of that. And then you also need to know how neurons are communicating with one another using neurotransmitters. And know at least a couple of the neurotransmitters. I would suggest know the 3 that I've provided here. The other thing that I want to point out is that as you're reviewing, you should make sure that you do know about the genetics of psychology, what you learned in the chapter about genetics and evolutionary psychology. Make sure you know those important concepts that were covered in the video and that are in your textbook. Make sure you also know about the divisions of the nervous system. Make sure you know about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. You should know what the somatic nervous system is. You should also know that the autonomic nervous system is what is comprising the parasympathetic and sympathetic. You should know what the fight or flight response is and what homeostasis is and which division's responsible for the fight or flight. Remember, that's the sympathetic nervous system. You should also know which division's responsible for homeostasis, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. You should know about the main parts of the brain that you learned about. You should know about the lobes of the brain. You should know about the main structures that have been covered. You've learned about Broca's area, Wernicke's area. You learned about the corpus callosum. Again, you learned about the 4 lobes and their functions. You also learned about the limbic system, the brainstem, and the hindbrain. Make sure that you know the structures that are within those systems and what their functions are. You also learned about how the brain is studied. So make sure you know about that. At least have a pretty decent overview of what you've learned about how the brain is studied. And then you also learned about the endocrine system. So make sure that you know what the endocrine system is, what its function is, what are hormones. You learned about some of the significant endocrine glands, including the pituitary gland, for example. Make sure you know those things. And as always, please don't hesitate to let me know what questions you have. I'm not going to read through these slides for you, and I don't want to do that because I don't want you to feel as though you need to know this. And again, I think that's beyond the scope of our introductory psychology class. But for those of you who are health science majors, you could, of course, take the time to look at each of these slides and pause in between as these move forward. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all online, and please don't hesitate to let me know what questions you have. This will continue for about 3 more slides where you'll see the action potential 5 basic steps.